Well, before we get started in the sermon, how about we have a time of prayer for our time in the Word? Father, I know that with everyone else here, we're hoping that your Word will be profitable to us today, that it would clear our minds and replace our attitudes and our thoughts with much higher attitudes and thoughts to match your own. That we'd be renewed in our strength, especially those of us that have had some pretty difficult challenges recently, that we'd be prepared for the future, whatever it may bring. We know that your word is powerful for all of these things, and we have, those of us who are believers, we have known that power, and we're just asking for it again. I ask your help for me as I try to teach your word well, but I ask that everyone here would receive something from your abundance today. And I ask that, those here that are, not yet believers, that something in your word would stir them to repentance and faith. And we're just asking for you to fulfill your own purposes in this world and in our lives. So we're asking things definitely according to your will, and we're asking them in the name of Christ. Amen. All right. Well, today I'm going to continue teaching through some sermons that I'm doing as a break from the Gospel of Matthew. I had 4 of these sermons planned. This is number 3. So we're at this moment halfway through. By the end of the sermon, it'll be 3/4 of the way through, but oh well. But today's sermon in particular here, this is another kind of sermon. I have done these on occasion, not often, but I have done sermons like this where I give you advice for reading a particular book of the Bible. So surely that has some use for us as we read the scriptures over and over again. This time I'm focusing on the book of Job. So definitely be turning there or have a finger there if you're not there already, because we'll be going there and spending most of the time there. These advisory sermons that I give are meant to help you understand the main goals of the book being studied and why you should bother with the book being studied. So in this case, what do you expect out of this book? What are the purposes of this book? Why was it written? Those kinds of things, so you can at least have something of a bird's eye view of the book before you launch into reading it the next time you read the book of Job. And my sermon today is simply called Advice for Reading Job. It is what it is. And my outline has 5 headings, which I think, these things together are a good summary of what's going on in the book of Job and what you should be trying to get out of the book of Job as you read it. First, the book of Job may not comfort you in your suffering, but it will teach you about your suffering. So don't necessarily come to this book expecting comfort, but do expect to learn something about a very real and very frequent part of life. And then secondly, the book of Job opens by showing that God's purposes for pain are beyond our understanding. And that is, sort of the, kind of the beginning of, if there's any main line of thought throughout the book, that is it. God's purposes for pain being beyond our comprehension as humans. Third, the book of Job includes much debate, full of truth, but missing the point, which is something you don't often expect to encounter in the Bible. The truth, yes, but truth that misses the point of the situation. That's one of the very unique features of the book of Job, so I want to talk about that. Fourth, the book of Job demonstrates how fragile our righteousness can be under suffering. And that heading is mostly focused on the man Job himself and what we see from him as he goes through his trials. And then finally, the book of Job ends by telling us to humble ourselves so that God will exalt us at the proper time. So if you're wondering where all this is going, what the big application is, it's about humbling yourself before God. especially in the context of your suffering. Now, my main reason for doing this sermon now is because it seems rather relevant for our church at this time. As I look at the kinds of things a lot of us have faced as of late, we're coming into a time of some pretty difficult, hard times overall. A number of us are going through some very difficult situations, whether in our own lives or people that we know and care about. It's just a very heavy time for a lot of us, and even those of us that are unaffected are still affected because people we love are affected. And that's sort of the general burden of things right now as I sense them. Now, as for me personally, it wasn't too long ago that I could barely stand on account of my own constant pain from arthritis. I thank God very much that is no longer the case, and I've been symptom-free for a little over a year now, just barely over a year, and I'm very thankful for that. But that whole phase of things is still very fresh in my mind, and of course, it's not like that's the only hardship I have ever faced. So I very much, on the topic of pain and suffering and these kinds of things that we encounter in the book of Job, like I have my experience with that. And the rest of us, I know we do too. If any of you are 100% fine right now, do not get comfortable with being 100% fine, because it is inevitable. You are heading into some kind of trial. It will happen. And this is just a fact of life in a fallen world among people. And the big challenge we face, especially as those who very much entrust ourselves to God, is what do we say about all this pain? What do we actually say about human suffering? Well, I directed you to turn to Psalm 34 as a first passage, but I just have a very quick portion of that to read as an opening thought. Psalm 34, verses 17 through 19, gives us a somewhat balanced perspective on all of this. It says, "The righteous cry, and the Lord hears, and delivers them out of all their troubles. The Lord is near to the brokenhearted, and saves those who are crushed in spirit. Many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord delivers him out of them all." So in this passage, and really throughout the Bible, we see the precarious balance of our lives, really, having the promise of many afflictions, but also God's care and deliverance. Both are there. It's not unmitigated suffering. It's not, being completely preserved from all suffering. It's actually both kind of mixed together throughout your life. And those three verses give a very good summary of what it's like to be a believer in God and how we frame ourselves against suffering. We have no choice, based on passages like this, but to learn to live between past pain and future pain, or to live with present pain and occasionally seeing the deliverance of God and occasionally seeing the renewal of sufferings. It's very much how life is lived. Not by accident, God has included a whole book in the Bible which deals directly, not only with suffering, but with individual suffering. The book of Job's suffering, one man being absolutely blasted in every way you can imagine. And I highlight that, the individual suffering, because that is the worst kind, especially if you are the individual suffering and no one else around you is. Like, that is the absolute loneliest and most crushing form of pain. When one person alone suffers, that person can easily feel victimized by God in some special way, very much as Job feels throughout the book, if you listen to the things he says. And it's hard to not see why he thinks that, given everything that happens to him. So individual suffering, very heavy, very much a part of life, and God has included a whole book of the Bible to deal specifically with that. However, the book of Job does tell us that individual suffering, even individual suffering, has meaning beyond the pain itself. It may look like that you are suffering and you are in this alone, but it's actually part of something greater overall that God is doing. Whether you appreciate that at the moment or not, whether you ever appreciate that, it is part of something more and greater. So with all that in mind, let's see what God has for us in the book of Job and see what God would have us think about individual suffering as we encounter it throughout our lives. And of course, we'll start with the first of those headings that I gave you in my outline for today. And that is perhaps the most ironic of all my headings for today. The book of Job may not comfort you in your suffering, but it will teach you about your suffering. So we're needing to redirect our minds away from comfort for a little bit to learning, which is possibly the worst way to begin with just thinking of people's emotions, but it is nonetheless how God approaches us in the book of Job. Now, I do want to say that, though, in the least dogmatic way possible, that the book of Job may not comfort you in your suffering. I grow hesitant to make these very absolute statements, where I say, well, it's never comforting to read the book of Job. I don't want to say that. It's quite possible that you yourself or someone you know was greatly comforted at some point or have been comforted reading the book of Job. That's quite possible. People are different. God deals with us in different ways sometimes. That said, I am inclined to believe that such immediate comfort from the book of Job is the exception rather than the rule. I don't think that the book of Job was written specifically to be a book of comfort. I don't think that's necessarily the goal of the book, and therefore I don't think it happens often. It may happen sometimes, but not often. I don't think we give enough attention to how the book of Job runs contrary to our expectations for a book about suffering. If you just think in your mind about the books maybe you see in a bookstore or a library, maybe the self-help kind of books or the psychological type of books, books about dealing with suffering, what are they like? And then frame those against the book of Job, and they are very different overall. And even from a Christian perspective, I'm not even talking about worldly perspective versus Christian perspective. I'm talking about how anyone would try to deal with suffering. The book of Job just doesn't do that. And to frame this against something, how many times have I used the word frame so far? Sorry, I got to stop saying that word. To give you some background for how to think about this, even as a Christian, let me just read briefly something Paul says from one of his letters. This is a rather classic passage on suffering and on comfort. 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 3 through 4. This is just something he says briefly to them at the beginning of his letter. Blessed be the Lord and Father of our Lord, blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies and God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our afflictions, so that we will be able to comfort those who are in any affliction with the comfort with which we ourselves are comforted by God. Okay. According to Paul, one of the reasons we suffer is so that we can experience God's comfort and so we can share God's comfort with other people when they suffer. That's a nice thought. That's a good thought. You should practice that sort of thing in your life. Absolutely. It's in the Bible. That being the case, you would expect the book of Job, which is entirely dedicated to individual suffering, to be a book full of God's comfort. You would expect this to be a book that comes alongside you like a friend, puts an arm around your shoulder, and tries to build your spirits in some way. And yet, the book of Job just isn't like that. When you really think about it, it doesn't seem to be written to be a comforting book. The book of Job could have taken one of two very common approaches to your suffering with the aim of comforting you. Anytime a person tries to extend comfort to another person, usually that happens in like two different ways, at least when we're thinking about words and not just actions, but how you speak or write to someone. The book of Job could have been a philosophical treatment of suffering, explaining why we suffer, the benefits of suffering, and some of the more profound implications of our suffering. Now, some people might find that rather boring or detached. Other people are very much helped by that. Some people are they're just built in their minds in such a way They want to connect everything to something larger, and they want to understand how it all is mapped out. They want to know the A, the B, the C, and the D of suffering and all those kinds of things. And so they want to read books like that. Okay, that's an approach people have taken from time to time with suffering, and some people are comforted by that. There's another way, probably a more common way, to write a book of comfort for suffering. And that is the kind of book that presents to you very kind, very reassuring words, written in the softest, most beautiful language possible, perhaps even poetically, really, target the emotions of the affected person and try to sway them away from their sorrow into, a sense of relief and comfort, basically. That's also very common, I think probably more common than the first approach. Either of those, you might expect to find a book like that somewhere in the Bible. What we get is the book of Job, which is not either of those things. The book opens with a man who has everything a person could possibly want, being stripped of everything without ever discovering why. Loses his family, loses his possessions, loses his health, brought from high to low in a matter of just a few days. And don't let that one fact escape you, he never finds out why. Like nowhere in the book of Job does he ever get an explanation at any point. We get it because we read the book, from the perspective of the author. But Job never finds out why. Most of the book then, after the initial crushing of Job, most of the book is given to an endless, unprofitable debate in which Job's friends tell him he's suffering because he's an evildoer, which is not true. And we know that too because we're reading the book, we get all the information more than any of the people in the book get. We know Job isn't suffering because he's an evildoer, but that's what all of his friends think, and that's all they have to say to him. That's it. Job even tells those friends they are worthless comforters. Very relevant for the point I'm making right now, that the book of Job is not a book of comfort. Toward the end of the book, God appears, saying nothing at all by way of comfort, but humbling Job for speaking without knowledge. And that's just it. He just comes and says, "What are you talking about, Job? What do you know?" And that's what God has to say when God finally shows up in the book and intervenes directly in this poor man's life. No person in the book even comforts Job at all until the final chapter. We're talking the final few verses of the book. Some people finally show up and comfort Job on account of his sufferings. We go 42 chapters. The man never gets comfort until then, like ever. The book of Job breaks both methods of comfort, being almost anti-philosophical and showing the lack of proper comfort among people. I call it anti-philosophical because in all the debate, in all the cerebral talk that all the characters go through, they're all wrong. Like, it's anti-philosophy. They don't have a clue what's going on. And as for the lack of comfort, no one comforts Job to the very end. Even God doesn't seem primarily concerned with comfort as he appears in the book. So for those reasons, I say, and I think we should keep this in mind very clearly, the book of Job may not comfort you in your suffering. It may not be your go-to book. If you feel like you need that kind of psychological, emotional boost, the book of Job may not be for you. If you're that kind of person, maybe you need to hang out in the Psalms a little bit more, if that's what you're going for. But I do think the book of Job will teach you about your suffering. There is something to learn. Despite its sort of anti-philosophical take on things, God is above even that. And God is doing something in this book, and there are things to learn. Our first instinct towards suffering, understandably, is comfort, whether receiving comfort in our own suffering or extending comfort to other people in their suffering. That's a good instinct. Paul talks about that in the passage I read just several minutes earlier, so there's nothing wrong with that. However, we should not let ourselves believe that suffering is merely an occasion for comfort, nor that suffering is simply a problem to be solved. I would say that's a very shallow way to approach suffering. It's not just about giving or receiving comfort. It's not just about solving the problems. There's another course of action to take to the pain that we encounter in life. And the book of Job takes that alternate route. I think, throughout it. We should be asking ourselves if our suffering can teach us anything. Is there content there that we can download into our brains for safekeeping in the future? And if the book of Job does anything, it teaches about suffering. It's meant to actually convey certain ideas that don't usually get brought up, even among Christians, I think, whenever we talk about suffering. So that is, the first thing I wanted to say about what you should expect to get out of the book of Job and how you should read the book. Don't look necessarily for comfort, but you should definitely expect to learn something about suffering. Now, all of this raises the question, what does the book of Job teach about suffering? Like, what is the content? What are we supposed to be learning from all this? Well, in the very least, the book of Job teaches that God's purposes for pain are beyond our understanding, as we see from the very opening of the book. This is, in a sense, right there, kind of laying on the surface for you, in chapters 1 and 2 of the book of Job. So God does have a purpose for these things. His purposes, though, are very much beyond your ability to figure out. If the book of Job has any main argument, that's it. God's purposes for pain are beyond our understanding. This is part of God's transcendence, God's inscrutability, if you want to use those words, that God thinks and acts on a very different level from humans, and you can't even really get up into that unless God reveals it to you. And God doesn't necessarily reveal everything to us, and that is very much true of our suffering as well. If I were to phrase this then as a piece of advice for reading Job, I would say try to fit the entire book into that argument, this whole idea of God's purposes for pain being beyond our understanding. Now, I mentioned the first 2 chapters of Job, so I want to go there as we talk about this. The first 2 chapters of Job are fascinating in that we alone, the readers, learn why Job is suffering. No one else on the earth learns that. It's entirely a heavenly matter for why Job is suffering. Let's read a couple passages from the first 2 chapters of Job. We're jumping into the middle of things here. Job chapter 1, verses 6 through 12. By this point, we've already been introduced to Job. Then we zoom up to heaven. Job 1, verse 6. Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. The Lord said to Satan, "From where do you come?" Then Satan answered the Lord and said, "From roaming about on the earth and walking around on it." The Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? For there is no one like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, fearing God and turning away from evil." Then Satan answered the Lord, "Does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not made a hedge about him and his house and all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But put forth your hand now and touch all that he has. He will surely curse you to your face." Then the Lord said to Satan, "Behold, all that he has is in your power. Only do not put forth your hand on him." So Satan departed from the presence of the Lord. There's round 1. We see Job get afflicted by basically losing his family to death. He loses all of his possessions, all of his wealth, and he has nothing left but his health. And even that's going to be taken away. Let's move on to Job chapter 2, verses 1 through 6. Again, we're focusing on the heavenly scenes here. Again, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them to present himself before the Lord. The Lord said to Satan, "Where have you come from?" Satan answered the Lord and said, "From roaming about on the earth and walking around on it." The Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? For there is no one like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, fearing God, turning away from evil. And he still holds fast his integrity, although you incited me against him to ruin him without cause." Satan answered the Lord and said, "Skin for skin. Yes, all that a man has he will give for his life. However, put forth your hand now and touch his bone and his flesh. He will curse you to your face." So the Lord said to Satan, "Behold, he is in your power, only spare his life. And from there we see Job afflicted with terrible boils all over his skin, and it goes into a description of how terrible that is. So we see, as the readers, we see that Job will suffer not because he has sinned, and not because God is somehow unjust, but because God wishes to prove a point, a very good point, that the righteous serve God whether they are blessed or not. We know that. We see this laid forth plainly here. God says twice that Job has done nothing wrong to deserve suffering, and it's not that God is unjust. There's a method to the madness, and the point he's making is a great point. I mean, you look at the world today and you see how people treat matters of religion, and it's just like, well, they're hoping to get something out of it. That's not right. Truly righteous people, they serve God whether they get anything out of it or not on this earth. All they care about is the favor and the grace and the love of God. That's it. And that's a very good point to make. Very helpful for us keeping a clean conscience and understanding what our priorities are to be. If you out there are serving God to get something out of it, you're wrong-headed. And the book of Job is part of teaching us against that. So all of this, it all works in and of itself as it's written here at the beginning of the book of Job. But Job himself never learns that. Job's friends never learned that. No one on the earth ever learns that, at least in the course of the book. It's totally kept a secret matter there in the courts of heaven as they talk about this stuff. So it's beyond the understanding of anyone in the book. Now, we might take that thought because we've been graced to have this written out for us so that we can read about it. We might say to ourselves, okay, good, so now I know why I will suffer sometimes. It's to prove that the righteous serve God whether they are blessed or not. You might try to take that and say, okay, that is the reason for any suffering I might have. But that's not exactly a logical argument when you think about it. The book of Job does not say that this is the reason for all suffering. It's the reason for Job's suffering. Now, maybe God has made the same point more than one time throughout history with other people. Maybe some of the pain you have encountered is for that same purpose. Maybe, maybe not. The point is, you're not standing in the throne room of God in heaven hearing all these spirits argue about things and decide what's going to happen down here on the earth. They might have some other reason to talk about you and your suffering. God might have some other reason to hand you over to Satan as he did with Job. There might be other things going on. You just don't know because you, like Job, are not standing in heaven listening to God and Satan and the angels and all of that talk about things that happen here on the earth. It's beyond us. It's entirely beyond us. It happens in a completely different realm we've not experienced. So even taking this information that we are given, even that doesn't explain every instance of suffering you're going to have. It's left completely blank almost. You're always expecting that your suffering is for some purpose, but you're never exactly told why, and the Bible doesn't tell us why all of it happens. Now, surprisingly, Job himself, the man Job, understands to some degree that God alone has wisdom, meaning that God will always know things which you do not know. And that's basically what we're talking about here when we talk about God's wisdom in this context. We're saying that God knows things that are beyond us and that we don't know, that we will never know. In some sense, Job has an understanding of this. He does talk this way at points in the book. I'm going to read a rather lengthy passage right now from Job 28, if you want to turn there. Job 28, starting in verse 12, we see one of these long speeches from Job. I'm going to read through verse 28 on this. But here's what he says. But where can wisdom be found? And where is the place of understanding? Man does not know its value, nor is it found in the land of the living. The deep says, it is not in me, and the sea says, it is not with me. Pure gold cannot be given in exchange for it, nor can silver be weighed as its price. It cannot be valued in the gold of Ophir, in precious onyx or sapphire. Gold or glass cannot equal it, nor can it be exchanged for articles of fine gold. Coral and crystal are not to be mentioned, and the acquisition of wisdom is above that of pearls. The topaz of Ethiopia cannot equal it, nor can it be valued in pure gold. Where then does wisdom come from? And where is the place of understanding? Thus it is hidden from the eyes of all living, and concealed from the birds of the sky. Abaddon and Death say, with our ears we have heard a report of it. God understands its way, and he knows its place, for he looks to the ends of the earth, and sees everything under the heavens. When he imparted weight to the wind, and meted out the waters by measure, when he set a limit for the rain, and a course for the thunderbolt, then he saw it and declared it. He established it and also searched it out. And to man he said, behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to depart from evil is understanding. I doubt so many lines would be given to that speech if it were not a major theme of the book, perhaps the major theme of the book, the idea that God alone has wisdom. And as for us, what are we supposed to do? Well, fear the Lord. That's wisdom. That's the extent that you understand those things. And so, when in doubt, fear the Lord. You're suffering, you don't know why, fear the Lord. Your friend is suffering and you don't know why, fear the Lord. That's basically it. That's what you get from the book of Job, which is in a sense very reductionistic, but it's the one thing you can always believe and do and remember when suffering comes. The book of Job shows that God's purposes for pain are beyond our understanding, beyond our wisdom, and we have to entirely react according to that realization and learn to fear God accordingly. For someone who is currently suffering, that can be a bit frustrating. Our instinct is to want to know why, and we usually care more about release from suffering than learning from it. So the frustration factor is certainly there. Job himself is frustrated for most of the book. We'll see some of that as we get through the sermon here. But our lack of knowledge simply highlights the need for more basic virtues, such as humility before God and His plan, learning to fear God, learning to trust God when we don't understand why. Because after all, we're never really going to understand why. So those virtues are always needed. Those virtues are always good and helpful. It's about thinking less and directing ourselves more to becoming the kind of person we're supposed to be in response to the suffering that we endure. Job learns things like this by the end of the book, and I will say more on that later when we come closer to that point of things. But that is the second heading that I wanted to cover with you, that God's purposes for pain are beyond our understanding, and we have to respond accordingly. Now let's move on into some other things about the book of Job that you need to bear in mind as you read the book and try to learn from it. Which brings me to my third heading for today, which covers most of the book of Job. So it's rather important for giving you advice about reading the book. The book of Job includes endless debate, full of truth, but missing the point. And I put a lot of weight on all those words I just threw at you. Endless debate, full of truth, but missing the point. I don't remember the last time I did this, so it's time to do it again. It's time for some stimulating statistics, as I very often like to give you when we talk about books of the Bible. So stimulating statistics for the book of Job. Of the 42 chapters in the book, 23 of those chapters are given to a debate. Right? So 23 of the 42 chapters are people talking to each other. That debate is between Job and his three friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. Their debate fills over half the book, right? 23 of 42, that is over half the book given to this debate. But really, if you want to count Job's long final speech and also the long speech of another man who comes in at the end named Elihu, then that debate will actually cover 34 chapters of the book, which is 4 out of every 5 chapters. 4 out of every 5 chapters, people just talking. And I think it's fair to count that all as one big thing, because those final speeches from Elihu and Job, they're all framed as responses to what the three friends were saying, right? So it's all one conversation. It's just that 2 people dominate the very end of it. But it's all one long conversation. 4 out of every 5 chapters of the book, most of this book, is given over to this debate, with so much time spent on that debate, you would think the debate would be of great value to the question of why Job suffered so badly. Right? That's what you would expect. That's what you would hope. All the space, like 4 out of 5 chapters of the book, surely there has to be something there of profit. You would be wrong to think that in terms of the overall course of the book. The whole argument of Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar is that Job lost his family, his property, and his health, all because he was sinful. That is the thing they say to him over and over again, round after round. They never get far from those ideas. But we know that's not true. Before they even show up in the book, we know they're wrong. We've been told that from the very first chapters of the book of Job, chapters 1 and 2. We know they're wrong, which means we just kind of nullify the whole thrust of their argument before they even begin. Just not true. Nonetheless, that is their whole argument. Let me give you just an example for good measure so you can see the kinds of things and remember the kinds of things they say to Job when they're talking to him. This is from Eliphaz, the first of the 3 friends, Job 22, verses 5 through 10, just to give you a sample of the things they say to him. Is not your wickedness great, and your iniquities without end? For you have taken pledges of your brothers without cause, and stripped men naked. To the weary you have given no water to drink, and from the hungry you have withheld bread. But the earth belongs to the mighty man, and the honorable man dwells in it. You have sent widows away empty, and the strength of the orphans has been crushed. Therefore snares surround you, and sudden dread terrifies you. Those are the kinds of things that Job's 3 friends say to him. They get kind of more and more bitter and crushing as the book progresses too. As for how Job answers those accusations, I'll speak more about that in a few minutes. I have a whole portion of this dedicated to Job later on. But the fact is, Job is required to waste his time answering false accusations. He never gets too far away from that in the whole course of things. That was not helpful for Job, and it makes the book frustrating for anyone who reads it. You're sitting there the whole time reading this just like, well, they get off it. They're totally on the wrong track. You just want them to stop and realize that they are wrong. You ever been in a situation where people around you are arguing endlessly about something and you just think they're a bunch of idiots, honestly, like they're getting it all wrong or what they're talking about doesn't matter? Job was trapped in that, except that he couldn't just leave because they came there to visit him. They were talking about him. He had to be there for this long, awful debate these guys are having about him. Just frustrating, absolutely awful. I said earlier that the book of Job includes endless debate, full of truth, but missing the point. And I mean all of that. When I say the debate is full of truth, I do mean that, despite everything I just said. Very often, Job and his 3 friends appeal to truth, whether truth about the character of God, truth about the state of mankind, truth about the natural world. They say a lot of stuff in the course of their speeches that is 100% correct. Like they have a lot of good facts. They have knowledge among them. It really is there. The great problem of the people in this book is that they fail at every turn to apply what they know correctly. They have good facts but bad arguments, or good facts and bad conclusions, you might put it that way. They've got all the right information, but they take it in all the wrong ways. It reminds me very much of a proverb about Proverbs, actually. Proverbs 26, verse 9, just to read this to you briefly. I always think of this when I think of Job's friends. It says, like a thorn which falls into the hand of a drunkard, so is a proverb in the mouth of fools. So here you are, you're a fool, right? But you get your hands on a proverb, right? A wise saying. And you think, now I've got this wisdom, I'm going to use it. But because you're a fool, you can't use it properly. It's just like a thorn in the hand. That's exactly what I think of when I think of Job's 3 friends. They've got a lot of good proverbs. They got a lot of truth. They're just fools. They don't know how to use this stuff. and they just come and they're just like, stabbing Job with these thorns over and over again, with their words. That's all they're doing. Perfect description of the arguments in the book of Job. Now, I think all this misapplied truth is still somewhat helpful for two reasons. The way they're taking their argument is wrong, but it's in the book of Job for a reason. It makes up most of the book of Job for a reason. There is a reason to have this stuff here. First of all, as you read the book, maybe one thing to say before I get into that, don't get confused, right? I think a lot of people get confused. Just because these men make correct statements does not mean they make correct conclusions. So just clarify that. You just got to have that clear in your mind as you think about, these men and what they're saying. But as for you and why this is important, it's important to remember because in your own life, whenever you suffer, you might encounter things like this. You might have your own set of friends that come to you who turn out to be worthless comforters, much like the men in Job's life. People, including Christians, will say all kinds of things to you when you are in pain. I think a lot of that is good-natured, right? They want to help you in your suffering. They want to be, that comfort to you, right? They don't always do a good job of that. And sometimes the things they say are, truths applied incorrectly. Sometimes they're not even that. They're trying, they really are trying, but they're just not doing a good job. So you got to remember as you deal with these kinds of things in your life, you might face those situations. You might also have to be somewhat discerning because like Job's friends, like I said, they give a lot of good information. They have a lot of right facts. They're just not applying it correctly. You might deal with that. If the people coming to you trying to comfort you in your suffering are Christians, they probably are going to have a lot of truth, and they might be talking to you in terms of the Bible and things like that, but they may not have it entirely right, what's going on in your life and how you should respond to it. So some discernment is needed. Now for Job, it was easy. He knew he wasn't this terrible sinner, right? He knew that. It may not always be so easy in your own life. Nonetheless, it does reflect the reality of things. You might very well find yourself whenever you suffer, dealing with people who are trying to comfort you, but not exactly doing it right and well. And you might have to deal with that in your own life. At least as you read the book of Job, be sure to have that in mind as you read the words of Job's three friends, because that is certainly the problem with them. Lots of truth, but all of it misapplied, and ultimately an unprofitable debate happening there. All right, well, I said I would speak more about Job the man and how he responds to his friends. And I'll do that now. This is heading number 4 in today's sermon. So from Job's responses, we can see how fragile our righteousness can be under suffering. This is the main thing I think you should take away as you read the book and as you think about Job himself as a person, the fragility of righteousness under suffering. Now let's not forget that this is the opening challenge of the book of Job, right? Job chapter 1, verse 9. Then Satan answered the Lord, "Does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not made a hedge about him and his house and all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But put forth your hand now and touch all that he has. He will surely curse you to your face." Right? That's the opening challenge of the book of Job. Will Job maintain his righteousness against suffering when God no longer blesses him, when God actually works against him? As we read the book, we will look to see if Job continues to fear God or if he curses God during his trial. Now, to Job's credit, he never curses God, even though his own wife told him to do so. Even though the circumstances certainly were conducive to Job cursing God. He never does that. In that sense, Job does endure. He endures a great trial without doing the one thing that Satan really wanted him to do. He never actually curses God. And in that sense, this is the sort of thing that is very often, I think we pick up on this more than anything when thinking about Job as a person. James certainly has statements like this. This is James chapter 5, verse 11, just quickly here. Wrong page. There you go. It says, "We count those blessed who endured. You have heard of the endurance of Job, and have seen the outcome of the Lord's dealings, that the Lord is full of compassion and is merciful." The endurance of Job. I think usually we pick up on that as we read the book. You know, the whole temptation was for Job to curse God. Job never actually curses God throughout the book. So, you know, good job there. On the other hand, Job's conduct is still not exactly that of someone who fears God as he ought. You know, this is the other half of Job and his experiences. And this, I don't think, gets enough attention as we think about the book of Job, as we talk about the book of Job, as people preach from the book of Job. So I really do want to focus in on this, because the truth is, we really see the righteousness of Job begin to fracture in the book. And it seems to get worse as it goes on. We really start to see the stress start to weigh in on Job, and the things that he says throughout the book start to sound not quite like the righteous man we found at the beginning of the book. And I think we see this in three ways. So if you're wondering what I'm talking about, I have examples for all these things that I'm talking about here. First of all, much of what Job says comes from his pain rather than his faith, his patience, or any other virtue. He is very much speaking from his suffering when he talks. Job chapter 7, verse 11, I think, is a very quick example of this. He tells you plainly what he's doing. Job 7, verse 11, he says, "Therefore I will not restrain my mouth. I will speak in the anguish of my spirit. I will complain in the bitterness of my soul." Right? Job complains for much of the book, actually. A good number of his speeches are very much the tone of complaining. Which is understandable given the circumstances, but it's also a far cry from how we all hope we will be when we suffer. You know, we hope that we can do things, as Paul says, without grumbling or complaining. But Job complains a lot as he talks in the book. So not quite up to the level that we would hope a man of God would be, not quite up to the level that we hope we would be in the course of our sufferings. But there's some other examples here I want to talk about as well, some other ways that Job speaks in the course of this book. Number two, we see that Job's complaining causes him to complain against God, which he does more than once in the book. So he never curses God, but he does kind of complain against God at several points in the book. Just to give you an example of this, Job chapter 10, verses 1 through 3. This is one of Job's statements here. He says, "I loathe my own life. I will give full vent to my complaint. I will speak in the bitterness of my soul. I will say to God, do not condemn me. Let me know why you contend with me. Is it right for you indeed to oppress, to reject the labor of your hands, and to look favorably on the schemes of the wicked?" Like, those are pretty tall words coming from Job to God. And he says specifically, "I will say these things to God." And he goes so far as to accuse God of oppressing him. He accuses God of favoring the wicked, since they often do not suffer like Job does. And that's a recurring theme in Job's words as well. He very often gets to talking about the wicked. They prosper. They're doing all right. I'm over here suffering. What's going on? He talks that way a lot. There's a lot of complaining toward God in the course of the book of Job. Again, understandable, but not quite to the degree that we hope we would be if we were suffering in Job's circumstances. Finally, Job continually repeats the claim that he has a right to argue with God regarding God's decisions. You know, this is like, Job believes he has the right to meddle in God's decrees for how he governs the world. Again, I have an example of this for you. This is from Job 31. This is Job 31, verses 35 through 37. Remember these words because quite a contrast to how Job speaks later when God actually shows up. But here's what he says earlier on in the book. He says this, "Oh, that I had one to hear me. Behold, here is my signature. Let the Almighty answer me. and the indictment which my adversary has written. Surely I would carry it on my shoulder. I would bind it to myself like a crown. I would declare to him the number of my steps. Like a prince, I would approach him. Now, I chose that example because it shows the real problem that's fueling a lot of Job's emotional torment. And it's not so much the suffering as it is his pride. He's getting into some prideful speech here. Surely you know that nobody approaches God like a prince. Okay, that's not how this works. If you ever come into the throne room of God, you're not entering that like a prince. You know, there's only one royal person there. That's God, not you. But Job thinks his own opinion of his suffering is so correct that he can strut himself into the throne room of God and argue with him. And that's what he wants to do. He wants this chance to plead his case before God, which he says very often throughout the book. So it's a common refrain for him. Now, from Job's responses, we can see the fragility of the man's righteousness. It's starting to get cracked a little bit as he goes through these pains and sufferings that he endures. Now, I consider this worthy of remembrance as you read the book, not only for having a right understanding of the man Job, what he's going through, and the quality of person he is under suffering, but for other reasons. First and foremost, and I can't help but observe this, the very best reason to remember the fragile righteousness of Job is that it glorifies the steadfast righteousness of Jesus all the more. And this is kind of a thought that maybe you wouldn't immediately go there, but does Jesus ever speak like any of this whenever he begins suffering there at the end of his ministry? I mean, when he's being whipped, when he's carrying his cross, when he's on the cross, do you hear anything like this? I mean, probably the blackest statement made by Jesus on the cross is, my God, why have you forsaken me? Which is, not necessarily an accusation against God, but that's like the deepest he gets into grief. Job is like way worse in the things that he says to God or about God. But Jesus, I mean, for the most part, when you see the contrast between these two, Jesus looks like top notch. And of course we would expect that. We know as a doctrinal fact that, Jesus, the Son of God, is sinless. But when you see the man on the earth that God himself said was the most righteous man on the earth, Job, and you see him really start to crack under the strains of suffering, and then you go over and look at Jesus and just see the glory in his passion, it's amazing. So I want to point that out to you just so you can read this. Reading the book of Job as part of the whole Bible here is like it really gives you a fresh appreciation for how high the standard of sinlessness is and how well Jesus met that standard compared to a man who is a righteous man but not anywhere close to Jesus. So remember that as you think about Job. Now, secondly, I think Job's fragile righteousness ought to make you guard your own heart more carefully when you suffer. Because let's face it, complaining against God, wanting to argue with God, those are pretty common responses to suffering. I mean, very, very common overall. And just remember that when you start to talk that way, it's like, Job started talking that way for a little bit. And when God showed up, he had some choice words for Job on those very topics. So maybe it's time to not do that and not complain against God in those ways when you suffer. So kind of a good negative example. Don't be like Job in that way when you suffer. Finally, in dealing with other people during their trials, it helps to remember that people often speak from their pain. And I made that the first thing I said about Job when he talks about his sufferings in the book. He tells you very specifically, he's speaking from his own anguish. He's giving vent to the bitterness of his soul, as he puts it. That's very common. And when you go to someone who is suffering, they're very often going to talk that way. And, just remember, before you get in there to arguing with them about the state of their soul and the rightness or the wrongness of their words, just remember that that's a little bit more like Job's friends, and they were worthless comforters. This is not the time to argue with the person about the quality of the things they're saying or like I would say even about their spirit, their spiritual state, I would recommend against that. Because when they're in that degree of pain, they're just talking from their pain. Once they're through that, they won't be saying those things. And that's true of Job as well, to be honest with you. The man Job, that is. So hopeful to remember that as a pointer of wisdom here. You know, when you go to people and they're suffering, they're going to talk a lot like Job. But it's really kind of the result of their pain. And, you know, there are things that might need to be squared away there spiritually. But in the book of Job, God is the one who deals with that. Like, God is the one that shows up at the end and sets Job straight. Job's friends didn't do anything. Like, they're just worthless. God is the one that sets them straight. So, you know, be there for that person, you know, comfort them in ways more like Paul would say, you know, and just pray for them, I would say, and let God do his work in that person's soul. That's my advice to you based on what we're seeing here in the book of Job. And also I hope that's helpful as you think about the book of Job itself and as you read it. Now I mentioned that God is the one that shows up and deals with Job, so we need to get there. This is the last thing I have to say today and the last part of the book of Job itself. So this last heading is addressing the pride which sometimes comes out in Job's complaints against God and how God deals with that. Now, God himself addresses Job's pride toward the end of the book. As I've said several times and as we see at the end, God himself appears to Job in the whirlwind, you know, in the storm is the way God appears at the end of the book. And the book of Job ends in this way, telling us to humble ourselves so that God will exalt us at the proper time. So this is sort of the final stroke of the book of Job. The point of all this is learning to be humble, learning to fear God and humble yourself so that God can exalt you later, which we also see in Job's life. So amazingly, this is the ultimate lesson to learn from individual suffering. You know, I said that this book is about individual suffering. It's good to have a book in the Bible that's about that. What's the chief takeaway? What's the chief lesson? You know, it's not about comfort, it's about humility. It's learning to humble yourself under the hand of God in the times when you suffer. So, what happens in those final chapters of the book? We're going to jump around a little bit, but I do want to read some of this for you. The final portion of the book is when God actually arrives. Job 38, reading just verses 1 through 3 here, says, "Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, 'Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Now gird up your loins like a man, and I will ask you, and you instruct me.'" Like, that's quite a challenge when God shows up and says, "Hey, Job, can you teach me something? I didn't know if I heard all these things you were saying correctly. So tell me again. Let me ask you some questions and see what you can instruct me." God then spends 2 chapters, 2 whole chapters, humbling Job by describing God's own great works and the power and wisdom required to create and control them. Like, God is just boasting about himself, frankly, which is, and I don't think we hold it against him because it's amazing. Like, the things he talks about in these 2 chapters are wonderful, and we're just holding, we're just like, yeah, and it's like, hey, Job, what do you know about anything? And that's exactly the point. God then demands an answer from this broken, grieving man after lecturing him for 2 straight chapters. Here's how it goes at the beginning of chapter 40, starting in verse 1. "Then the Lord said to Job, 'Will the fault finder contend with the Almighty? Let him who reproves God answer it.' Then Job answered the Lord and said, 'Behold, I am insignificant. What can I reply to you? I lay my hand on my mouth. Once I have spoken, and I will not answer. Even twice, and I will add nothing more.'" So the man who claimed that he would stroll up to God's throne like a prince now has nothing to say to God. Like, he has elected not to answer. He's going to exercise his right to remain silent because he knows anything he says is going to be used against him coming up. So he's going to stay silent. But as for God, he's not satisfied yet. God spends another 2 chapters humbling Job again in much the same way as before. He just adds on to this. It's like, I think Job just said uncle, right? Like he said, okay, I'm done. I'm tapping out. Like I can't take this. And then God does the same thing over again to the exact same degree. Like God's not even done yet. So he just again pursues this humbling of Job. And then we see Job's final response in chapter 42, verse 1, reading through verse 6. Says, "Then Job answered the Lord and said, I know that you can do all things, and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. Who is this that hides counsel without knowledge? Therefore I have declared that which I did not understand, things too wonderful for me, which I did not know. Hear now, and I will speak, and I will answer, and you instruct me? Well, I have heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. Therefore I retract, and I repent in dust and ashes." Now, God is apparently pleased with that response because God stops lecturing Job. God then rebukes Job's 3 friends for not speaking what was right about God. And he says that in those words, he rebukes them for not speaking what was right about him. Afterwards, we discover that Job is given just as many children as he had before and twice as much wealth. So it's all been kind of brought back to a higher state of things than he was at the beginning. And at least Job gets a happy ending from all of those things. But what's the point of all this? Well, as I said toward the beginning, the ending of the book is short on comfort. God has zero interest in comforting Job when he shows up. He doesn't come in a rainbow, he comes in a whirlwind, right? He's coming to get Job, like he's going to let him have it. Nonetheless, the ending of the book powerfully shows our need to humble ourselves so that God will exalt us at the proper time, which is exactly what happens. He humbles Job, and then once Job is sufficiently humbled, he lifts Job back up, higher than he was before, in fact. Now, if you're remembering that wording that I'm using from somewhere else in the Bible, I'll tell you where I'm getting that. This is from 1 Peter chapter 5, where Peter says something that I think is a very good summation of what we're supposed to take away from all this. 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 6, "Therefore, humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you at the proper time, casting all your anxiety on him because he cares for you." And of course, that's the ideal, right? To whenever you suffer anything, whenever God seems to be dealing rather ferociously with you, to humble yourself under God, to cast your cares and your anxieties on him, and trust that he cares for you. That's a tall order. It can be difficult to do, especially when the suffering is really, really bad. But that is the ideal. Job himself doesn't necessarily live up to all of that, but he does get there. And because he does humble himself at the end of the book, God does exalt him at the proper time, just like Peter describes here. Now, Job's case has been made into a reminder of something not often discussed with regard to our suffering, and that is pride. I mentioned that earlier. We see God deal with Job's pride very forcefully there at the end of the book. Job already knew how to obey God. He was very obedient. God himself said in the courts of heaven to Satan, said, "Hey, have you looked at this guy? He's righteous, he's blameless, there's no one like him in the whole earth." Job knew how to obey God, but by the end of the book, Job has learned to fear God. Like he has learned to actually humble himself and realize the dread power and wisdom that are in God, and that you don't lift your voice against God. Even if you're suffering, even if you disagree with the way God's doing things, like you don't speak against God in those times. You got to humble yourself. Now, suffering has then this rather strange way of leading in either direction. It can either lead you into greater pride or lead you into greater humility. Sometimes it's a roundabout trip from one to the other, which is what we see in Job. He gets kind of prideful, but he eventually gets humbled, and it all turns out well. Some people just get prideful, and they never repent. They're unlike Job. They never repent of their complaining. They never repent of their attitude. Some people, I think, by the grace of God, are able to endure suffering very humbly. Jesus would be the greatest example by far. But even among other Christians, I think we've seen that, some people that are, dealt a very bad hand, so to speak, but, they accept it from the Lord and they humble themselves and they very much, entrust themselves to God in those times. And that's the ideal. That's where we really need to be. We need to have that kind of humility and that kind of fear of God to where we respond that way automatically and instinctively. So, that is the great takeaway of these things. And it's important to remember that. The suffering that you endure, it comes and goes, very typically in life. When you're in the middle of the suffering, though, you got to remember, that's temporary. That's eventually going to go away. Even if it kills you, that's still temporary, right? Technically, right? That's still a temporary suffering. If you're a believer, you go from that into the joys of the presence of the Lord. So it's all temporary. And once that pain passes, you're not really left with anything except your own memories of it and the state of your conscience. You want to be able to look back on those days of pain and say, I trusted the Lord through that. I humbled myself under that. I didn't complain against God. I didn't, say things that I regret now. That's where you want to be. So when you encounter suffering next, or someone that you know and love is suffering, it's important to keep these things in mind and to live accordingly. Be sure to suffer rightly so that you have no need to repent, as Job eventually did. Well, all of that is the incredibly unique way the book of Job treats individual suffering. Again, it's not at all what you expect from a book about suffering. It's not the comforting approach, but, there's a lot to hear. And it's very needful to hear. So let's review these things, then we'll be done. First of all, I said that the book of Job may not comfort you in your suffering, but it will teach you about your suffering. So the first piece of advice for reading Job is to read it with the right expectations, a desire to be taught, not necessarily a desire to be comforted. As for what the book of Job teaches us about suffering, it shows us that God's purposes for pain are beyond our understanding. Although it may seem like an empty lesson, it sets up for the chief lesson of the book about humbling ourselves. It's made much easier to do that when you recognize your own ignorance. Once you understand that you don't know everything in the universe, you have a better ability to humble yourself at that time. Thirdly, speaking of ignorance, the book of Job includes much debate, full of truth, but missing the point. Job's friends demonstrate that knowing truth and applying the truth are very different abilities, especially about suffering. It's possible to have the one but not the other, like them. However, despite the blamelessness of Job at the beginning of the book, the unfolding events demonstrate how fragile our righteousness can be under suffering. Job often complains even against God with an attitude of pride, and that is the chief thing that we need to avoid, as we go through suffering. And that is corrected in Job's life by God himself when he shows up, as we see in the 5th heading, that the pridefulness of Job eventually draws the attention of God, who ends the book humbling Job and teaching us to humble ourselves so that he will exalt us in the proper time. So far from being a mere conclusion to the book or just a happy ending, we should read the entire book, really, as an exhortation to humility during our own trials. Remember, the fear of the Lord, that's wisdom. Job had that right, but he didn't get it right in his life. He got it right by the end of the book, but it took him some time to get there. But that is my advice to you for reading the book of Job. Next time I have one more sermon that I want to do before we get back into the Matthew study. This last message I have planned is going to be a weird one, but hopefully it'll be helpful to you as you read your Bible. Right now, are there questions or comments about the book of Job or anything I've said about it?